first way that you can deal with it is you can just get rid of Social Security altogether. Is it my job to protect your grandmother?
So wait. So you think that there are people getting a lot more out than they ever put in? Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's the opposite of what you said in your debate with Hans. One of the claims you made was that, Social Security is terrible because you don't get as much out as you pay in. It's good to know you've
No,
reversed that, at least
you
for the
need to
purpose
learn
of
how
this
to
debate.
contextualize things.
Okay, sure.
When me and Hans were discussing this, what I said to Hans specifically is that there's a lot of people who end up paying their entire life into that system and barely get anything out because the life expectancy rate increases, right? So what you're doing is you're conflating two different things and then pretending like there's a positional flip-flop. Just because I say that there's a lot of people who end up paying a lot into this system and don't get nearly as much out as they put in, it does not mean that most people aren't getting more out of the system than they put in.
Well, in that debate, you also said that life expectancy isn't actually going up significantly because the reason that life expectancy has gone up is only because the child mortality has gone down. It's not because people are actually living longer. But that was dead wrong as well.
That's also not true. You're fucking lying through your teeth.
I'm not.
What I said is that they use an average for infant mortality rate in order to judge life expectancy. Would you like me to prove that to you?
Would you like me to prove what?
Would you like what I said in that debate was that they use infant mortality rates in order to come up with the number for life expectancy. That's what I said.
Yeah, I believe the context of that comment was Hans saying that doesn't raising the retirement age make some sense if we're living a lot longer. And your response was that we're not actually living a lot longer. It's because rather there's a lot less babies dying. And that average is being pulled up, not because we're living longer lives, but because people aren't dying as children anymore.
Yeah, I don't
But you're
believe
saying the
you
opposite here.
because you framed the first thing incorrectly, and I think that you're just framing this incorrectly too. All
That's
I've
fair.
ever stated as my position over and over and over again was that the average life expectancy is determined by using the infant mortality rate, which is true.
All right. Well, even framing it that way, we still are living a lot longer past the age of 65. At least that's the best way to frame it under that framework. If you don't believe me, that's fine. But
I
I would
believe
just
it's
ask
70.
you,
I believe it's 72 now.
72, the average age.
I think that they raised it originally. Social Security, I think that they raised originally. I think it was 60, 65 or 60 or in the low 60s, and now it's 72 for full rates. I'll have to check. I think it's something in there.
I believe to get full benefits, you end up at 67. I believe that you are incentivized to some extent to take it at 70 if you want. But that's obviously a
who
different.
cares? The point being is, one more time, you keep
up,
on. Yeah. Well, why are you straw manning over to a Hans debate anyway?
I'm not. It seemed like you're taking very, very different stances based on the two debates, and I just want to be clear as to what your actual position is, right?
Well, I have given you my actual position on it. My actual position is that you just want to raise taxes in order to make sure that the system is solvent, when we could easily privatize the system, and it would make people a lot more money if we did.
Sure. So, okay, so I guess that's a valuable pivot to the next part of the conversation, right? So I guess fundamentally you would take the position that Social Security is not worth investing in. Like it's better to just have everyone,
because we don't know what shifting demographics are going to look like by the time we get. So you could maybe put a Band-Aid on it to make it solvent, but you don't know what the demographics will look like 30 years after that. You might have to do something drastic again. Just pointing to the success of the Social Security program when we had stable demographics and everything was kind of going in the favor of Social Security via the baby boom, women entering the workforce, the amount of retirees coming out versus the amount of young people that you had to tax to pay them out, is not a recipe for what future generations are going to have to deal with, considering the shifting demographics in the United States.
Right. So I would say that with regard to the idea that we should privatize Social Security, I suppose it depends on what you actually mean by privatize Social Security. I've already proposed the idea of taking the trust fund and investing it into private funds in order to allocate those funds a little bit more efficiently, get a little bit more return on your dollar, on your trust fund dollar. That'll extend the life of the program a few years, a little bit more sustainably. It's partially what Norway does with their pension fund. It's what a lot of countries do with their pension fund. The U.S. just has this weird constraint on only investing in treasuries, right? So you get a little bit less return.
Yeah, and bonds.
Now, well, treasuries are bonds. It's just a different word for bonds. So
yeah, it's bonds.
You know,
And what are bonds paying out in interest rate now? Like 2%?
Yeah, it's around 2%. So
and it was at 5%.
Was it 5%?
I think it was 5%. Yeah.
Bond yields go up and down over time.
Yeah,
the way
but now
that
we're dealing
bond
with
yields
inflation, so then now we're at 2%, I believe. I believe it was inflation that's caused the decline in the interest percentage on bonds.
No, if we had long and sustained inflation, interest would actually go up because you'd have to mitigate for the risk of inflation within your bond yields, right? So it's a market determined rate fundamentally, and so it's it's not really surprising to hear that yields have gone down over time as inflation has gone down. And in response to this uptick in inflation, you wouldn't really expect bond yields to go up immediately because expectations are somewhat anchored. That's kind of an irrelevant point because Social Security payments are adjusted for inflation anyway, and so inflation isn't as much of a concern for people getting Social Security today. Rather, what I would rather talk about is what is the actual effect of privatizing Social Security. That's really, I think, the better conversation. What do you imagine in terms of privatizing Social Security looks like? Just get rid of Social Security, have a mandatory retirement system, just let people do whatever they want. What's your advocacy?
Say the last part of that question again. I was just reading how you're wrong about bonds, but go ahead. What was the end of that question?
Well, I want to hear how I'm wrong, BPF. Tell me.
On inflation, and we'll get to it in a second. But give me the last part of the question.
Okay, we'll get to it in a second. I'll hold you to it. So, the question is, what's your actual advocacy? Do we just get rid of the system, let people do what they want? Do we have a mandatory private, insurance scheme? What do you imagine in terms of a retirement system? But I guess tell me how I'm wrong first.
You could do it one of three ways. All right.
Tell me how first.
I'm trying to. The first way that you can deal with it is you can just get rid of Social Security altogether. The entitlement program in and of itself, which I have absolutely no problem with. None. I think that people are much more responsible when it comes to making their investments now as they've ever been, and that you're going to have winners and losers just like you do right now with Social Security, of which even at the maximum benefit, the elderly people who don't have other things like Roth IRAs, et cetera, they're not exactly living their best life, man. So that's one. The first thing is you can just abandon the system. The second thing that I would say that maybe you could push into would be some type of privatization, which is would be similar to a 401k system, just managed by the government instead. I would probably not like to see that except as a last resort. Okay. And then the third way that you can do this is you can have the government invest in the actual market with Social Security funds, giving you a huge return if you're using safe market bets. And you can probably pay people a lot more money than they've ever seen. But I don't see that happening either. So the stock market would be very resistant to that. And they would probably call it market tampering and everything else. So probably privatization would be the middle ground that I could meet you on.
Okay, sure. So getting rid of Social Security. Well, wait, really quick. How am I wrong about bonds? I want to hear.
I'll send you over the data. You didn't send me over your screenshot either, by the way.
I did. I linked it in the chat.
Let me see.
I also sent it to you on Twitter because for some reason I can't paste an image on the Streamlabs link.
Okay, well, where's the index specifically? This is the whole fucking paper. Which thing are you referencing specifically?
You're right.
What
it's
page?
33 pages. Page 21. Page 21. I got it right there for you. But anyway, so well, anyway, send me how I'm wrong on bonds in the first place. I really don't think I am, but. The point is that on your first thing, how to getting rid of Social Security altogether would be terrible. People are, on average, not quite so long-term thinking, and that's why we've seen huge poverty alleviation as a result of mandatory savings accounts across pretty much every single country that's had some sort of conception of mandatory retirement, whether it be a Social Security-style system, superannuation in Australia, where it's basically what you described, private, sort of mandatory 401ks. So it just depends on the system. But what doesn't depend is the idea of mandatory retirement, contributions, and then mandatory payouts, sort of entitlement payments once you retire. People are not responsible when it comes to saving for retirement, and this is where the government comes in to alleviate part of that concern. So I disagree with the first premise of just getting rid of it altogether. Now, with regard to private mandatory 401ks, other countries do this. It wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. It would just require a lot of regulation so as to ensure that people's 401ks are managed appropriately, and so as to ensure that they are managed equitably, right? Because one of the problems with only private mandatory 401ks is that it probably wouldn't be the most equitable system because lower income people wouldn't be able to invest as much, and we'd end up with a relative amount of income inequality over time, which is probably not the best thing, all else equal. With regard to the third thing, having the government invest in the market with Social Security, sort of contributions, that's actually what I suggested in the very beginning. You say you don't really see this happening. I actually could see it as a little bit more likely than privatizing the entire system, mandatory 401ks. And this is actually what I referenced. Norway does this with their pensions. There's many, many local governments that do this, right? Whenever you hear about the New York Police Department pension fund, that's what they do. Universities and university endowments, that's what those are. So, many, many local governments do this. Many state governments do this. Many countries across the world do this with various funds and treasuries that they can pull money from. So I actually see that as somewhat likely.
Okay, got you. So your problem with my position of just getting rid of the system altogether is that you think that it'll have a negative effect on the elderly, essentially.
I would go so far as to say that I know it would have a negative effect on the elderly.
Right. So here's the thing, and here's my proposition to you. Tell me why it's immoral.
Why? What is immoral?
Tell me why it's immoral for me tomorrow to opt out of the Social Security system, only focus on utilizing that money for my own personal retirement benefits rather than continuing to subsidize elderly people who paid into the system and the government can't afford to pay it back out to them because they went and spent all the fucking money.
Well, the government can afford to pay it back out to them, at least currently. But I get what you're saying. Maybe in the long term, that's a little bit more dicey. The point is just to say that the reason I think it's wrong, I think that we should have a little bit more of a collective mindset, right? To say that, hey, we're all paying into the system and we can all take out of it in the future. It turns out that that's good outcomes, right? Elderly poverty's gone down, financial destitution of the elderly has gone down quite a bit.
So wait, you're basing this all on positive outcomes for the elderly, right?
Yeah, I think that a society rightly can be judged by how it protects its most vulnerable people. The elderly are amongst that group.
Is it my job to protect your grandmother?
I think that it's all of our jobs to protect all of our most vulnerable in a society. I would say yes.
Okay. Why is it a moral proposition that I have to protect your grandmother?
Because I think that leads to a more happy and free society, right? I mean, for instance,
So
when we all pay,
that's a preference. You're not telling me why it's moral.
Well, you want to have like a hard philosophical debate. That's fine.
No, I'm trying to understand why it is that you can't give me a reason why we shouldn't get rid of Social Security, except that you say in your preference, me taking care of your grandmother is my moral responsibility. But if I ask you to justify it, right, you seem to be struggling.
Well, I'm not really struggling. We just have to get to the fundamental question. You're asking me to sort of morally justify why it's the case that we should have a more collective mindset in this regard. My explanation for that is it leads to the most positive freedom. It leads to the best outcomes economically and materially. Now, why do I value that in the first place? Kind of a utilitarian, bit of an egoist, right? I just think generally that leads to the most human happiness. That's the fundamental value that I'm
under. Under your system, you believe it gives you the most utils. That's how you're justifying this, right?
Utility, happiness, whatever you want to call it, lack of suffering.
Right. Well, we'll just call utils in this particular case. People not starving to death and dying right in the street, because apparently that's what was happening with elderly people before. This would be maximum utils in your worldview?
I think a society with the least possible people starving is probably maximizing utility to some extent, yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. So in your worldview, then, I just want to make sure I get this right.
Get it right.
You think that the reason that I should be subsidizing your grandmammy who paid into the Social Security system and at some point it's not able to pay her back out is because, well, that gives maximum utility to society, rather than holding the government accountable for the fact that they spent all the fucking money, never put any of it in a lockbox, because if they had put every dime of it in a lockbox, they never would have had this problem to begin with, right?